He watches the stars burn, not with anger, not even sorrow, just a silence so vast it could split worlds. His eye, just one, now, fixes on Terra, a distant jewel flickering behind layers of war and time. It is not hatred that fills him, but something worse, understanding. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the sorcerer who broke the world. But once, he was just a son trying to be heard. And the question that echoes across 10,000 years, was he ever truly a traitor? Or was he the last one who believed? If you've ever wondered whether Magnus fell, or was pushed stay, this is the story of the eye that saw too much. It begins not with war, but with a whisper. There was a moment before the heresy, before the flames of betrayal were fanned to a galactic blaze, when Magnus could have turned away. A single heartbeat. But to understand why he didn't, why he couldn't, you must understand what he saw. Not visions of power, not temptation, but the unraveling of fate itself. The warp had always spoken to Magnus, not in riddles, but in screams. Since childhood on the shimmering world of Prospero, he dreamed in truth. Not metaphor, not madness. Truth. It came at a price, his eye, his peace, and eventually his brothers. But what is the value of ignorance when it dooms the Imperium? The galaxy thinks of Magnus as the sorcerer who defied the Emperor. But that is the surface of a tragedy carved in flesh and fire. What if Magnus didn't disobey out of pride, but out of desperate love? He was the most psychic of all the Primarchs, and therein lay his curse. He cannot close his eye, even when he wanted to. Every future he saw bled into the present. Every voice of the warp clawed through his mind. He understood secrets the Mechanicus would murder to possess. He mapped the flow of fate like others studied maps of stars. And he knew, long before Terra did, that something had gone wrong. Horus, his brother, the favored son, Magnus saw the seed of corruption before it bloomed. He watched it twist inside Horus's soul like a serpent coiled in shadows. He screamed to be heard, but by then, the Imperium had already learned to fear what Magnus was. The Crimson King had long been too powerful, too strange, too loud in a galaxy that demanded silence from psychers. They called him heretic for asking questions, sorcerer for seeking truth. The Nikaean Council would silence him. His father would turn away. So, when the screams became too loud, when he saw Horus about to fall, Magnus did the unthinkable. He shattered the veil. He tore a hole through the immaterium itself. Not to attack, not to conquer, but to warn, to save. And in that act, he damned himself. Because what he broke was not just a veil. It was the Emperor's secret, the webway, mankind's last hope against chaos. One psychic scream, a pulse of desperate loyalty, and 10,000 years of decay began. The galaxy would remember the scream, but not the reason behind it. They'd call him traitor. But was he? Look deeper. Listen closer. Not to what the Imperium says, but to what Magnus became. This is the price of knowledge in a cruel galaxy. This is the tale of a man who believed that truth could save humanity. A man who learned that truth, without trust, becomes a weapon turned inward. The tale does not end here. In fact, it hasn't even begun. Because Magnus didn't fall for power. He fell because he loved too much. And now, across the ruined tapestry of the Imperium, his name is carved in ash and grief. But some still wonder if he's watching still. Wait, he was born beneath not to destroy the Emperor, and one but to forgive him. A child made of fire, shaped by sorcery, and haunted by truth before he could speak it. Prospero, red and golden, a jewel set adrift in the silent dark. It was here the crimson sun fell from the heavens, like all his brothers, cast across the stars by forces beyond comprehension. But unlike them, Magnus remembered. From a moment he opened his eye, the only one that would remain. He saw everything. He saw the weavings of time curl around his cradle. He saw beings in shadow, watching him like insects beneath glass. He saw the gods of the warp smile with teeth of galaxies, and he saw himself dying and reborn again and again in an endless spiral of ruin. This was the gift of Magnus the Red. Sight, but it was no gift. It was agony. When the people of Prospero found him, he was already speaking their language, already reading their thoughts. He did not crawl. He floated. He did not cry. He whispered names of things they did not know existed. To the Prosperine scholars, he was a blessing beyond measure, a living god of knowledge. To himself, he was a puzzle with no key. He learned quickly, too quickly. Ideas bloomed in him like wildfire across a dry plain. Magic, philosophy, physics, linguistics, memory, the boundaries between them blurred. He didn't study what the world was. He studied why it had to be. But what terrified even his most devoted tutors was this. Magnus never asked permission to learn. He broke through walls of thought like they were veils of silk. He danced through ancient grimoires like a predator through a field of sheep. He could pluck thoughts from minds across cities, feel the heartbeat of a man in orbit, know the death of a world seconds before it came. And yet, he was gentle. He smiled when he taught. He laughed when he argued. He mourned when knowledge died. He could have ruled Prospero as a god king, but he chose to teach instead, to build a society of thinkers, philosophers, warriors of the mind. But always, in the silence between thoughts, there was the sight. The warp never left him. It pulsed behind his eye like a second sun, and soon it began to mutate him. First the migraines, then the dreams, then the hunger, never for flesh, but for meaning. And finally the eye, the second one, the one that split his forehead like a scar of fire. A third eye that saw not the world, but the soul of it. Not light, but truth. They called it a mutation, a curse, a blessing, a sign. To Magnus, it was a burden. He could not shut it, could not rest, could not lie. Everything was always seen, even the whispers of the warp, even the voices that should not be. The first time a demon spoke to him, it didn't roar. It wept. It called him son. He banished it. The second time, it showed him a future, Prospero in flames. 1,000 suns turned to dust, terra sundered, and his father, the emperor, alone upon a throne of corpses. He tried to unsee it. The third time he listened, not because he trusted it, but because he had run out of reasons not to. Magnus' psychic power was not like his brother's. Lorger's faith could move worlds. Fulgrim's ambition could sculpt nightmares. But Magnus understood things the rest would die to ignore. Where the others saw prophecy, Magnus saw mechanism. The gears behind fate, the echo behind the scream. And what he saw, more than anything, was that humanity was not ready. Not ready for what the warp truly was. Not ready for the truth that psychers weren't afflicted. They were evolving. Not ready for the gods waiting behind the veil, smiling, hungry. He believed he could shield them from it. He believed he could bear the sight alone. He was wrong. When the Emperor finally came to Prospero, Magnus fell to his knees, not in fear, but in awe. Here was a being like him, more than him, someone who had also seen. And the Emperor looked into Magnus' eye, his true eye, and saw what he feared most. Not rebellion, not heresy, but potential. The boy would see too much, would ask questions not meant to be asked, would not obey, not because he was proud, but because he cared. Still, Magnus was welcomed, reunited, given command, given a legion. But the fracture had already begun. Even among his brothers, he was an outsider. The other Primarchs spoke in steel and conquest. Magnus spoke in riddles and light. Horus respected him, but never trusted him. Mortarion hated him outright. Russ, well, that hate would blossom soon enough. But Magnus didn't care. He had his legion. He had his purpose. To guide humanity toward a future where knowledge, not faith, not fear, would rule. A future he could see, just barely, just maybe. He would call his sons the 1,000 Sons. not for vanity, but for hope. Each one, a candle in the dark. Each one, a mind sharp enough to change the galaxy. And they would follow him, not because he demanded it, but because they believed. That is what made Magnus different. Even then, he wasn't born to conquer. He was born to see. But sight, in the grim dark of the far future, is a curse. And hope is the most dangerous heresy of all. Magnus never asked to be a god. He only wanted to understand them, and that the gods could never forgive. They were his mirror. In a galaxy of blood-forged legions and thunderous conquest, the thousand suns stood apart. Not for their victories, not for the worlds they took, but for the questions they dared to ask. Where others built empires with bolters and blades, the sons of Magnus built libraries, scriptoriums, sanctums of thought. Astartes, yes, but not brutes. They were warriors of the soul, each one trained not merely in war, but in the occult architecture of reality itself. They studied the warp not as a weapon, but as a wound. They dissected history not as propaganda, but as mystery. They learned runes like others learned ranks, and they followed a Primarch who saw in each of them not a soldier, but a spark. Magnus molded his legion into what the Imperium would never understand, a brotherhood of seekers. Their armor was red not for rage, but for remembrance, the flame of intellect, the burn of insight. On Prospero, they gathered knowledge like sacred flame. They uncovered ancient Xenos artifacts not to destroy them, but to learn. They communed with psychers, even the most broken, to understand the human mind's awakening across the stars. In the Tower of the Cyclops, the heart of their fortress, Magnus presided like a philosopher king. He would walk among his sons, not to bark orders, but to engage in debate. He listened. He taught. He asked questions that shattered assumptions and remade worldviews. His command was not taken. It was given by love and loyalty. In those days, there was peace, of a kind, but always in the quiet spaces the warp loomed. Psychers across the Legion began to change. Some subtly, a flicker in the eye, a breath held too long. Others grotesquely, flesh melting, voices splitting, souls wailing through broken mouths. It wasn't war that threatened the thousand suns. It was mutation, a silent plague in their gene seed, a warp-born cancer with no cure. They called it the flesh change. One by one, his sons were consumed by it. Proud warriors, learned scholars, twisting into monsters, screaming, begging, until nothing remained but flesh and ruin. Magnus wept, not once, not as metaphor. He wept. In chambers carved of marble and fire, he broke apart. This was not a disease of pride. It was a punishment, but for what? And then, the voices came again. They whispered from cracks in time, from relics thought inert, from symbols half-scribed. We can save them, they said. We can give them stability, strength, purpose. Magnus refused them, for a time. Instead, he buried himself in research, built temples to understanding, reached deeper into the warp than any mortal had dared. Without corruption, he told himself, with discipline, with clarity. But knowledge does not love its seekers. It devours them. And in time, Magnus began to listen, not to the promises, but to the patterns. He mapped the behavior of demons like astronomers map stars. He charted currents of warp energy, cataloged its reactions with psychic disciplines, theorized methods of control, and he shared it all with his sons. Each Astartes of the thousand suns became a scholar of the soul. They learned languages of dead races. They performed rites older than the Imperium. They recorded dreams like data. And most dangerous of all, they believed they were doing good. Because they were. The flesh change slowed. For some, it ceased entirely. Ritual and discipline held the rot at bay. But the cost was silence. The Imperium, so obsessed with obedience, so terrified of psychers, began to watch them closely. And when whispers of the Thousand Suns sorcery reached Terra, the first stones of damnation were already falling. Magnus knew. Of course he knew. He saw the suspicion, felt the distrust, watched as even his fellow Primarchs began to pull away. Yet still he taught. He believed, deep in his soul, that knowledge could redeem them. That if they were honest, if they were noble, then even the warp could be a tool for salvation. How naive he was, or maybe how hopeful, because the truth is, Magnus never craved power for its own sake. His sons weren't sorcerers out of ambition. They were desperate to survive, to grow, to matter, and Prospero flourished under their light. The cities were temples of understanding. The people lived not in chains, but in dialogue. Learning was sacred. Debate was holy. Faith was placed not in gods, but in the relentless pursuit of the unknown. No other Primarch created a world like this, because no other believed truth was worth dying for. And Magnus would. In time, he would watch his sons turn to ash, his legacy rewritten, his wisdom labeled heresy. But in these days there was still hope. In every scroll, in every whispered incantation, in every eye open to the true nature of reality. He did not train warriors. He trained witnesses. To the warp, to the lie of the Imperium, to the silence of the Emperor. And the greatest tragedy of all, he was right. The warp would not be ignored. Psychers would not go away. Humanity would awaken, screaming. And the only legion prepared to understand it will be the first condemned. The Thousand Suns never wanted war. They only want to learn. But in the Imperium, knowledge is heresy. And heresy is punished in fire. They were his mirror, and soon they would be his ashes. He stood in judgment, not over enemies, not over traitors, but over his own blood. It was called the Council of Nikaea, but it was not a council. It was a trial, and though they masked it in robes, ceremony, and legal pretense, everyone there knew the truth. This was the moment the Imperium decided whether to blind itself or open its eyes. Magnus stood before his father, not as a son, not as a warrior, but as a plea given shape. He spoke not with fury, but with sorrow. Around him sat warriors who had never read the texts he had written, commanders who feared what they did not understand. Some glared at him with contempt, others with uncertainty, few with compassion, but none with comprehension. And at the heart of it all, the Emperor watched in silence. Magnus argued not for freedom. He argued for preparation. The warp was not a storm to hide from. It was a fire to be harnessed. Yes, dangerous. Yes, unpredictable. But so was the galaxy itself. So was truth. And in the warp, humanity's soul had begun to awaken. We must understand it, he said, before it devours us. But the others, especially Mortar Ion, Lehman Russ, even Rogel Dorn, had made up their minds. To them, Magnus was the edge of a knife aimed at the heart of the Imperium. And then the edict came down. The Emperor's voice, calm, precise, unrelenting. Henceforth, the use of psychic powers is forbidden. The pursuit of sorcery is heresy. No Astartes shall walk the paths of the warp, save under the strictest supervision of sanctioned astropaths and navigators. The council is concluded. The silence after that pronouncement felt longer than any war. For Magnus, it was more than a rejection. It was betrayal, because what no one else knew, what only a handful of beings in the galaxy could know, was that Magnus had glimpsed the Emperor's hidden work. Beneath the surface of Terra, behind veils of secrecy thicker than any fortress wall, the Emperor had been building something. Not a weapon, not a fleet, a doorway, the Webway Project, a path through the stars untainted by the warp. A future for mankind where the demons could not follow. A future that needed psychic mastery to sustain it. Magnus knew this. He felt it. Perhaps he was not supposed to. Perhaps the Emperor hoped he wouldn't. But Magnus had always seen more than he was allowed to. And so, the Nikaean edict wasn't just a command. It was a paradox. The emperor needed psychers, but publicly denounced them. He was building a better future, but ordered his sons to blind themselves. Magnus begged to understand, to help. The emperor turned away. Why? Why would a being of such staggering intellect reject the one son who could truly understand him? Some say it was fear, not of Magnus, but of what Magnus proved. That humanity was evolving. That faith in steel would not be enough forever. That the warp could not be ignored, only mastered. Others believe it was pride. That the emperor would not allow even his sons to know the full truth. That trust was a currency spent too easily and rarely repaid. But whatever the reason, the silence grew, and Magnus began to unravel. Not with rage, but with grief. He returned to Prospero a changed man. Not broken, but quiet. Still teaching, still guiding. But beneath every word was a question he could not ask aloud. If the Emperor will not let us save humanity, who will? Then came the visions. Darker, sharper, painful to behold. Magnus had always seen shadows, but now they screamed. A name surged to the forefront. Horus. His brother. The War Master. The brightest star in the Imperial sky. Magnus saw him fall. Not in blood, but in faith. He saw Horus take the serpent's hand. Saw him kneel in places no mortal should. Saw entire legions turn their banners black. Saw terror burn. He saw it all. Over and over. Again and again. Every thread he pulled led to the same tapestry. The heresy. And yet, he was bound. Bound by his father's decree. To remain silent. To close his eye. But Magnus could not obey that order. Not because he was proud. Because he loved. He loved the Imperium. He loved his father. He loved the dream. The idea that humanity could be more than just war machines and blind worshippers. So he made his choice. He would warn the Emperor, even if it meant breaking reality to do it. Even if it meant defying the edict. Even if it meant damning himself. He gathered his most potent sorcerers. He prepared the ritual. He carved a path not through space, but through the warp itself, to Terra, to the Emperor's sanctum, the very heart of the webway. And with a scream of psychic light, Magnus cast his soul into the storm. What happened next shattered history. Because Magnus reached the Emperor, he warned him, and in doing so, he broke everything. The webway fractured. Demons poured in. The secret was laid bare. All of it undone. In one moment of desperate loyalty. The Imperium would remember it as an act of heresy. But the truth, it was an act of love. And in that instant, the Emperor did not see his son. He saw a threat. He turned to Malcador, to the Custodes, to Leman Russ, and Magnus. The Crimson Sun who broke the law to save the Imperium was marked for destruction. The edict had been spoken. The warning had been given. The silence had become a scream. And now, fire would answer. It was not a whisper. It was a scream. A cry of such magnitude it tore through reality like a blade through parchment. In that instant, Magnus shattered every wall that had been raised to keep the warp at bay. He did not do it with malice. He did not do it for power. He did it to warn his father, to save his brothers, to stop the heresy before it began. But the warp does not give without taking. As his psychic form hurtled through unreality, Magnus passed through layers of madness older than the stars. Thought became shape. Emotion became torment. Every lie ever told whispered in his ear like a lover. Every truth, ever silent, screamed like a child beneath drowning waves. Still, he pressed on. He crossed oceans of sin, climbed towers built from screaming prayers, dodged creatures made of regret and bone. His mind bled from contact with the Immaterium, but his will never broke. Because at the heart of it all, he believed his father would understand, that the Emperor would listen, not as a god, but as a father. But belief is not protection. When Magnus' essence breached the Golden Throne's sanctum, when he forced his way into the Emperor's private domain, he committed the greatest sacrilege imaginable. The webway cracked. It had taken decades to build. Thousands of psychers had been bled dry to power it. The Emperor's greatest secret, his last gamble to sever humanity's dependency on the warp, to make mankind untouchable by demons. It was all undone in a blink. A single act of love became a catastrophic violation, because when Magnus screamed through the veil, he didn't knock. He smashed in the psychic convulsion rippling across the Astronomicon. Magnus' message had landed. Horus is falling. The Emperor knew now, and that truth, bitter, cracked, and steeped in pain, was real. The heresy had not yet begun in earnest. There was still time, still hope, but there was no forgiveness, because the Emperor did not send gratitude. He sent execution. Magnus, broken and reeling, retreated from the warp. He returned to Prospero as a ghost of himself, his skin pale, his aura dimmed, his third eye wide open, seeing futures he no longer wished to know. He told no one what had happened. Not yet, because the message had come. Not a communique, not a sanction, but a sentence. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, the executioner, he was coming, not to reprimand, but to annihilate. The Emperor had issued the order: destroy the 1,000 suns, reduce Prospero to ash, leave no survivors. This was not a punishment, it was a silencing. Magnus had screamed to save them all, and for that, he would burn. He tried to prepare, tried to warn his sons, but even then, he hesitated. How could he justify what he had done? How could he explain that his loyalty had become his damnation? Some of his sons noticed. Armin, especially, the chief librarian, the sharpest mind of them all. He saw the cracks forming in their Primarch. The haunted look, the flinches at shadows, the long silences before speaking. Prospero did not prepare for war. It prepared for understanding. But war does not wait for comprehension. The space wolves descended like an executioner's axe. No warning, no preamble, just fire, just fury. And in the smoke, Magnus stood still. He could have resisted, could have unleashed powers the wolves had never seen, could have turned Leman Russ into ash with a word. But he didn't. He couldn't, because still, even now, he hoped the Emperor would understand, that someone would see the truth. Instead, the sky broke open. The 1,000 suns, his mirror, his blood, rallied to defend their home, not out of ambition, not out of vengeance, but out of love for their father. And Magnus? He watched it all burn, because the scream had already left his lungs. The damage was done, and now there was only ruin. He had tried to save the Imperium, and it began with fire, not the fire of war, but of judgment, raining from orbit, falling like a verdict scream from the heavens. Prospero, the world of scholars, of silent wisdom, of psychic flame, was set alight before a single voice could answer why. The space wolves came with fangs bared, but not as hunters. They came as executioners. Their blades were not drawn in caution, but in rage. This was not a siege. It was a purging. Leman Russ had been given an order, and he obeyed it with brutal clarity. Magnus had once considered Leman a brother, an opposite, but a brother. Where Magnus sought understanding, Russ sought simplicity. Where Magnus uncovered secrets, Russ buried them beneath blood. Yet in their opposition, there was once a kind of respect. Now, there was only wrath. The wolves descended upon Tzeentch, the shining capital of Prospero, with drop pods and thunderhawks in waves. Each impact shook the earth. Each howl shattered silence. In the libraries, scrolls turned to ash. In the towers, philosophers screamed, not in fear, but in disbelief. What? What have we done? There was no answer. Only death. The Thousand Sons fought, not because they were ready, but because they had no choice. Bolters were torn from museum walls. Runes were drawn in blood. Warriors who had once spent their lives decoding the warp now threw themselves into its heart, summoning its power like drowning men clinging to fire. And Magnus? He did not fight. He watched. From his throne in the Tower of the Cyclops, he observed the annihilation of his dreams, not with indifference, but with despair, because he understood the game now. He saw the strings. The Emperor had not merely ordered a punishment. He had sent a message. Obedience mattered more than truth. Control mattered more than loyalty. And for seeing too much, Magnus would be silenced. Ahriman, faithful Ahriman, begged him to act, to rise, to strike back. "We can win," he said. "We can drive them back. Just give the order." But Magnus only shook his head. "This is my punishment," he whispered, "for breaking the world." Still, even silence has its breaking point. When the wolves reached the tower, when the howls of Russ's most savage warriors echoed through the marble halls, when the suns Magnus had raised for centuries began to fall, torn apart not by chaos, but by ignorance, he snapped, not with rage, with pain. The psychic scream that erupted from the tower cracked stone and sky alike. Thousands fell to their knees, bleeding from eyes and ears. The warp howled in answer. Even Russ paused. And then, at last, Magnus rose. He did not wear armor. He did not carry a blade. He was war. With a wave of his hand, entire squads of wolves turned to dust. Runes flared to life across the battlefield, slicing through reality itself. The air ignited. The ground bled. The sea around Tzeentch turned to glass. But Magnus did not rejoice. He wept. For every wolf he struck down, a part of him fractured further. This was not what he wanted. This was never what he wanted. And then they met. Leman Russ, the Wolf King. Magnus, the Crimson Sun. Brothers once. Enemies now. Their clash shook Prospero to its core. Russ was fury incarnate, swinging his blade with the weight of imperial wrath. Magnus parried with force of will alone, bending the warp around his broken heart. But for all his power, Magnus hesitated. Even now, even here, he still held hope. And Russ, who never hesitated, took that moment and drove his weapon through Magnus' chest. A howl, a flash, a scream. Magnus fell, not dead, but shattered, his body broken, his soul flung into the warp. And in that instant, the last light of Prospero died. The Thousand Sons, leaderless, staggered. Ahriman gathered what survivors he could. The wolves burned the rest. The City of Light became a mausoleum of ash. Scrolls older than worlds turned to cinders. Statues crumbled. Names were forgotten. And in the skies above, the banners of the Imperium fluttered not in victory, but in silence. The dream of knowledge had been reduced to ruins. But the war was not over, because Magnus was not gone. Not truly. Not yet. In the eye of terror, a spark remained, and soon it would ignite again. His body was broken, his soul untethered, his sons scattered across the ruins of their home, drowning in fire and disbelief. And Magnus the Red, once the brightest flame of psychic mastery, once the philosopher king of Prospero, was gone. But death in the warp is not death. It is transformation, and I was watching. As his essence bled into the immaterium, the forces that had whispered to him for years came forth, not as tempters, but as hosts. They welcomed him with open arms, not as a prisoner, but as a prophecy fulfilled. Magnus floated through the tides of unreality, his soul splintering and reforming with each beat of warp light. He saw visions of infinite timelines, realities where he had obeyed the edict, where he had turned to the Emperor, where he had stood with Horus, where he had died on Prospero's walls. And in all of them, he lost. There was no future where truth triumphed. Only silencing, only chains. He screamed, not in fear, not in pain, but in the horror of certainty, because the warp showed him what the galaxy truly was. Not a place of reason, but of myth, not governed by truth, but by narrative. And he had been cast as the heretic, the betrayer, the mad sorcerer. It did not matter that he warned them. It did not matter that he bled to save them. The script was already written, and so he made a choice, not to fall, but to survive, because if the Imperium would not accept the truth through light, then he would bring it through shadow. Magnus reached out, not to any demon prince, not to any court of chaos, but to Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the architect of fate, the only being in the galaxy who saw the world not in good or evil, loyalty or treachery, but in possibility. Magnus did not kneel. He negotiated. "I will not be your slave," he said, and Tzeentch laughed, not mockingly, but with delight. "Of course not," he replied. "You will be my mirror." What followed was not a possession. It was not corruption in the way mortals fear. It was a merging, a rebirth. Magnus' shattered soul reformed in coils of blue fire. His body expanded, transfigured, wings unfolding from his back like great pages of an unwritten tome. His eye, always one, burned with insight that split the minds of those who dared meet it. And thus, the Crimson King was reborn, not as a Primarch, as a demon prince. To some, that title is a curse, a fall from grace. But to Magnus, it was freedom, because now, finally, he could see without being punished for it, speak without being silenced, act without begging for approval. He returned to his sons, those who remained, not as the teacher he once was, but as a being becoming myth. They did not recognize him at first. His form towered over them, impossible and divine. But his voice, his mind, was the same. "Do not kneel," he told them. "Stand, for the galaxy will try to erase us again. And next time, we will be ready. Armin, loyal still, asked the question they all feared. What are we now?" Magnus paused, and then, awake. That answer cut deeper than any blade. Because the Thousand Sons were no longer a legion. They were remnants. Fractured, mutated, hunted, but they were awake. And in their exile, they would learn what it meant to truly see. They took refuge in the warp, carving their own domain, the planet of sorcerers, a realm of shifting thought and screaming skies, where reality bent under will and language could cut deeper than steel. It was no paradise. It was a fortress. Here, Magnus began his second great work. He no longer sought the Emperor's approval. He no longer hoped for redemption. He would become the one thing the Imperium feared most, a truth that would not die. He studied the warp not with reverence, but with command. He unraveled the mysteries of demons, not to worship, but to wield. He watched the tides of the great game, manipulating threads, whispering to agents across space, planting seeds in the dreams of rogue psychers and inquisitors alike. He was no longer trying to stop the heresy. He was planning what came after. But deep within him, the wound remained. Because Magnus had not fallen for ambition. He had not lusted for power. He had tried to save humanity, and in return, he had lost his home, his father, his name. Now, he stood atop a tower of burning thought, watching the galaxy from a realm no sane man could endure. And he waited for the Imperium to collapse under the weight of its own ignorance, waited for the moment when knowledge, long suppressed, would explode like a dying star. But even in this new form, he was not at peace, because his sons were changing. Warp mutation twisted many beyond recognition. Once learned warriors became monsters of shrieking flesh and spiraling eyes. Discipline faltered, madness seeped in. His legion was slipping from his grasp, and Magnus, now divine, could not stop it. He had traded his mortality for power, and found that even that could not save the things he loved. The Emperor's silence had broken him. Prospero's ashes had remade him, and now, Tzeentch's embrace was completing him. But what he had not expected was the price of memory, because Magnus remembered everything. Every name of every son, every word of every lesson, every scream that echoed through the burning streets of Tizca. Every time he had chosen mercy and been answered with violence. And in his quietest moments, deep within the cyclopean sanctum of his new throne, he asked a question that haunted him even now. What if I had obeyed? What if he had never warned the Emperor? What if he had stood by and let Horus fall unopposed? What if he had let silence reign? Would Prospero still stand? Would his sons still breathe? Would he still have his name? But the warp offers no answers, only change. And Magnus, the Crimson King, the Demon Prince, the most loyal traitor, had changed forever. Not because he wanted to, but because the galaxy gave him no other choice. They were melting, not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. One by one, the 1,000 sons, those once proud sons of Prospero, clad in scarlet and gold, wielders of thought and flame, were turning to monsters. Their flesh twisted in a chitinous horror, bones knotted into shapes no anatomy should know. Some screamed until they lost mouths to scream with. Others wept, liquid eyes dripping through their helms. The flesh change, long suppressed, had returned. And this time, Magnus cannot stop it. His legion, already shattered by the burning of Prospero, was being hollowed out from within. What the wolves hadn't killed, the warp now claimed. Ahriman, first captain, chief librarian, most brilliant of Magnus' sons, watched in helpless horror. He had endured Prospero's death. He had followed Magnus into the warp. He had accepted exile, mutation, madness. But this was extinction. Magnus, enthroned in his tower of endless reflection, said little. He had become distant, larger than form, trapped between memory and prophecy. His words came slower now, heavy with the weight of divine consequence, and the mutating screams echoed louder. Ahriman begged for permission to act. Magnus said nothing. He saw too much now. Every path Ahriman might take led to ruin. Every spell led to disaster. Every action, every question was a loop of damnation. But Ahriman, unlike his father, was done waiting. Where Magnus hesitated, Ahriman moved. He gathered a cabal of the 1,000 sons' most powerful sorcerers, each a master of discipline, each warped by desperation. They met in secret in a labyrinth of glass souls, beneath a sunless sky that pulsed with thought. There, Ahriman spoke. We are dying, not from war, but from what we are. Our curse, our blood. If Magnus cannot save us, we will save ourselves. The others hesitated. To act without Magnus was heresy, but to do nothing was annihilation, and so they prepared the rubric. It was not a spell, it was an event, a rewriting of soul and gene seed alike, a flame that would sear the Legion clean, strip away the warp's mutating touch, fix the minds of the 1,000 sons in place, forever. It was salvation, it was damnation. The ritual began. Ahriman's voice echoed with ancient syllables. forged from truths best left buried. He called upon the deepest strata of the warp. Not demons, not gods, but the laws behind them. Symbols of power were carved into the very air. Runes bled from the ground. Time froze, watched, then bent. Across the Legion, it spread. Some fell to their knees in agony. Others burst into light. And then, silence. The flesh change stopped. The screams ended. The mutation ceased. It worked. At first. But then came a cost. Those 1,000 sons who lacked the psychic discipline, who were not sorcerers, but warriors, thinkers, scouts, suddenly disintegrated. Not destroyed. Not dead. But emptied. Their armor stood tall, motionless, silent, soulless. Just dust. Their spirits erased. Their minds gone. What remained was a shell. Eternally bound. Eternally loyal. Automatons in crimson plate, armed and obedient, but hollow. The rubric had saved the Legion's mind, but at the price of its soul. Magnus felt it happen. The moment it hit, he rose from his sanctum like a storm. He descended upon Armin not with anger, but with grief. "You stole their choice," he whispered. "You rewrote their fate." And Armin, proud and broken, said only, "I saved them." Magnus' fury exploded, not as flame, but as emotion, raw, unbound. He cast Armin and his cabal from the planet of sorcerers, flung them into the warp itself, to wander as outcasts, cursed with knowledge and burdened with the consequence of action. Exile within exile. Armin did not protest. He had expected it. What he had not expected was the silence that followed. Magnus did not speak to his sons again, not for a long time. He withdrew, deeper into his tower, deeper into thought, into grief. His legion now stood in ranks of gold and crimson, their eyes empty, their voices gone. The rubric had preserved them, and in preserving them, had destroyed them. The 1,000 sons were now a legion of statues, and Magnus, their father, was a god of mourning. He walked their halls sometimes, whispered their names, touched their helms with clawed fingers. They never responded, but he remembered each one. They had once laughed, debated, questioned. Now, they obeyed without voice. The Imperium called it heresy, but the truth? It was grief given form, a legion that had asked too many questions, and received only silence in return. Magnus had fallen not to chaos, but to necessity. Armin had acted not out of betrayal, but desperation. And the rubric, it was not a curse. It was the scream of a dying dream. Preserved, hollow, unforgiven. And still, across the void the Eye of Terror watched. The galaxy turned, the Imperium burned, and the dust of the 1,000 suns stood vigil, forever ready, but never again alive. The skies over Terra bled fire. The end had come, not as prophecy, but as consequence. Brother turned against brother. The traitor legions, twisted and reaved by the warp's unmaking, had brought war to the cradle of mankind. Titans fell like gods dragged down. The walls of the imperial palace thundered with the dying roars of demigods. And above it all, the Astronomicon flickered. The Emperor sat immobile upon the golden throne, bound in eternal vigil. Horus, the fallen sun, the war master of ruin, drew closer every hour. And yet, Magnus did not walk among the armies. He did not lead a host, did not stride across Terra's surface in challenge or glory. He haunted it. In the warp above and around Terra, Magnus became an echo, a psychic shadow flickering at the edge of every battlefield. He did not come to conquer. He came to understand. He watched, observed, waited. He had no desire to break Terra's bones. That dream had already died on Prospero's burning streets. Now he sought something else. Answers, regret, closure. He drifted through the minds of Imperial defenders as they screamed their last, whispering apologies only they could hear. He hovered at the edge of the Golden Throne's psychic field, never daring to breach it again. And when he looked toward the Emperor's spirit, the pain returned like a blade to the heart. Even now, after all the ruin, Magnus still loved his father. And he hated that love, because what had it brought? Everything Magnus had done, every desperate act, every step toward damnation, had been in the name of that love. To warn, to help, to save. And the Emperor had repaid him in silence. In exile, in fire. Was it justice? Was it fear? Or was it simply necessity? The warp gave no answers, only distortions. Magnus wandered through psychic corridors, torn open by battle. He passed titans locked in death throes, Leviathan dreadnoughts screaming across the sky. He saw Fulgrim revel in madness. He saw Perturabo drive iron through flesh. He saw Mortarian's poison breath wither life by the acre. And he wondered, is this what Father feared in me? That he would become like them? But Magnus had not changed in the way they had. He did not serve chaos with joy. He did not wear his corruption like armor. He was not a godling in love with his own undoing. He was still the son who warned him. And yet, here he was, a demon prince, unloved by the gods, feared by mortals, forgotten by brothers. He appeared only once, fully, during the siege, not in flesh, but as a storm of thought and fire, rising above the shattered spires of the Librarius Tower. Imperial psychers saw visions of a crimson giant with one eye weeping flame. Some dropped dead, others fell to their knees, screaming for forgiveness. But Magnus spoke only once, his voice rippling through the warp. I saw the fire before it came. I tried to warn you, and then he vanished. Leman Russ, leading the space wolves through the bloodied streets, heard that whisper and tightened his grip around his axe. He had killed Magnus once, or thought he had, but now, even he wasn't sure. In truth, Magnus did not fear death. He feared being forgotten, being erased, that the only memory of him would be the scream, the fall, the monster. And so, in the siege of Terra, he did not claim glory. He claimed presence, a ghost in the warp, a scar in the Emperor's dream, an echo in every librarian's mind who dared to look too far into the immaterium. He did not march with Abaddon. He did not kneel to Horus. He did not beg for absolution. He simply watched, because he had seen this all before, long ago, on Prospero, in the visions that had ripped his mind apart. He saw Terra burn. He saw the Emperor die. He saw the galaxy fracture into shrines and war zones. He had tried to stop it, and he had failed, not for lack of power, but because truth is not a weapon the Imperium accepts. And when the end came, when Horus was struck down, when the Emperor was interred in his living tomb, Magnus did not celebrate. He mourned, not just for the Emperor, but for what might have been. He had seen a future of light, of psychic awakening, of understanding. Instead, he stood in the aftermath of apocalypse. The dream had died, but he remained, and the wound he carried never healed. To this day, the warp over Terra bears his mark, a ripple of sorrow, a resonance of regret. No demon has ever fully replaced him in that place, because even the gods fear a ghost who will not forget. Magnus the Red, Prince of Sorcerers, Father of Dust, was never truly part of the siege. He was its witness, and that, perhaps, is the cruelest fate of all, to see everything, and to be believed by no one. The galaxy changed, empires collapsed, stars died, gods rose in the minds of madmen. Cadia broke, the cicatrix maledictum split reality in two, and the Imperium cracked under the weight of 10,000 years of silence. And through it all, Magnus watched. He had not forgotten. He had not forgiven. He had not stopped seeing. While his brothers, now demon princes, waged war for pleasure, for hatred, for devotion, Magnus remained focused. His purpose was never conquest. It was understanding. And now, more than ever, the Imperium proved its failure. The Emperor, a corpse god bolted to his throne, still demanded worship through silence and fire. The Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, was adrift, blind, spiritually starving. The Mechanicus clung to superstition, still fearing what they couldn't control. The Inquisition, bloated and paranoid, murdered psychers by the millions. And psychers were awakening in record numbers. It was happening, exactly as Magnus had said it would. Humanity's soul was mutating. The psychic tide was rising. And still, they called it heresy. So Magnus returned, not with armies at first, but with visions. Across 100 worlds, imperial astropaths collapsed screaming, muttering his name. Red suns bled into strange constellations. Dreams cracked like glass. And in the minds of rogue psychers a voice whispered. He was right. When Magnus did rise in force, it was not to make war. It was to make a point. He chose his target not for strategy, but for symbolism. Luna, the moon of Terra, the birthplace of the Primarchs' gene forging, the place where Magnus had first become more than myth. He came with the full wrath of his legion, those who still bore minds, and those who stood as rubrici. The skies above Luna turned red. Reality bent around his passage. Demons of logic and flame stalked through vacuum. Warp storms encased the moon in a psychic veil. This was not a siege. It was a statement. The Imperium reacted with panic. They did not understand why Magnus was here. Luna was not a stronghold. It held no great prize. But that was the point. Magnus was not there to take. He was there to remind that he still lived, that he still saw, and that he had not forgotten the wound of Prospero. Then came the answer. Robert Guilliman, the returned son, the Lord Commander of the Imperium, the one Primarch who now walked in daylight, armored in legacy and sanctioned by a desperate, dying empire. Their confrontation was inevitable. Magnus and Guilliman met not with swords, but with presence. One, a burning god of memory and regret. The other, a living statue of order and pragmatism. And for a moment, time stopped. They were brothers once, raised in isolation, forged for unity, torn apart by silence. Magnus spoke first. You returned, and already you chain yourself to the same silence that killed us all. Guilliman's reply was a blade wrapped in sorrow. You chose madness. You embraced ruin. No, Magnus said, I chose truth, and truth burns in a world that fears it. They fought, not just in body, but in mind, in will. Guilliman, a master of strategy. Magnus, a hurricane of psychic force. The warp itself recoiled from their clash. Time fractured. Statues wept blood. Reality screamed. And in the end, Magnus retreated, not defeated, not broken, but finished. He had said what he came to say. You cannot silence a ghost by killing it. And Magnus, now more than ever, was a ghost of a better future. He returned to the planet of sorcerers, but he did not rest. He had seen the rift, the cicatrix male dictum. He had watched as the Imperium tore itself in half. And in that moment, Magnus smiled, not with joy, with purpose, because now at last the galaxy was listening. He began sending envoys, not demons, but psychers, into the warp-torn dark, whispers of a different Imperium, one built not on fear, but on knowledge, one where the psychic awakening was not a curse, but a sign. Some called it the Reclamation, others heresy. Magnus called it hope. And in the black of the void, on broken ships and ashen worlds, scattered psychers heard his voice. You are not alone. You are not broken. You are becoming. The Imperium redoubled its purges. The black ships overflowed. The Inquisition howled, but it was too late. The truth had escaped. The warp was rising. And the Crimson King, the one-eyed prophet, the demon prince who had tried to warn them, was ready. Not to conquer, but to be remembered. Because now, the galaxy was Magnus' library, and every war, every fall, every silence, was another page in the book he would never stop writing. He is called many things: the Arch-Sorcerer, the Crimson King, the Demon Prince of Tzeentch. But of all the titles pinned to his name by a galaxy too broken to understand him, only one truly stings. Traitor. They say he betrayed the Emperor. They say he shattered the web away, consorted with demons, raised a legion of heretics. They say he chose chaos, but they never ask why. They never ask what it means to be loyal to a dream that refuses to see you. Because the truth, carved beneath the ash of Prospero and whispered in the haunted minds of those who dare to remember, is far more painful. Magnus didn't fall because he lusted for power. He fell because he cared too much. He was the most loyal traitor, the son who screamed when no one would listen, the scholar who bled himself trying to save a future built on lies, the prophet who warned the emperor of what was coming, not in defiance, but in desperate love. And that love was answered with silence, with edicts, with execution. In the Imperium, there is no room for nuance. You are loyal, or you are damned. There is no space for a son who sees too far. No place for a mind that questions the script. Magnus asked why. Why are psychers feared when they are the future? Why is knowledge a sin? Why is obedience the only language the Emperor speaks? And for those questions, he was labeled heretic. What would you have done if your home burned because you tried to help? If your brothers turned their backs? If your father sent death instead of dialogue? Would you not rage? Would you not change? They say Magnus blow. Worlds left open, Gilliman exposed. Weak points in the veil around Terra. But he does not strike. He watches. He waits. And sometimes, he whispers into the minds of librarians who dare dream. Sometimes they listen. One such soul, a psyker doomed to be fed into the Astronomicon, once asked him, "Why do you keep fighting?" And the Crimson King answered, "Because I remember a time when we could have been more." That is the tragedy of Magnus. He does not fight out of vengeance. He fights because the dream still burns inside him, screaming to be believed. He is not the monster they painted. He is the memory they buried. He was never the most dangerous traitor. He was the most loyal son. And for that, they made a myth, made a madness, made him dust. But the dust still moves. The myth still speaks. And the madness still remembers what it once loved. He does not sleep. There is no rest in the eye of terror. No peace. No silence. Only the ever-churning sea of thought and nightmare, where gods play games with galaxies and memory bleeds into madness. And yet, amidst the storm, one figure remains still. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the one-eyed god who was once a man. He sits upon his throne in the Tower of the Cyclops, carved from impossible geometry and lit by flames that whisper forgotten truths. Around him spiral tomes that write themselves, bound in skin, etched in sorrow. Every moment that passes becomes another entry in the library of his grief. He watches, not with rage, not even with hope, but with memory. Across the immaterium, his gaze drifts, over broken worlds and burning cathedrals, over psychers bound in chains and planets that scream beneath the weight of ignorance, over Terra, where his father still sits, silent, unmoving, a god without voice. He wonders, sometimes, what the Emperor thinks, if he thinks at all, if he remembers a son named Magnus. If he ever did, Magnus could destroy much. He could shatter astropathic choirs with a thought. He could collapse faith itself on hundreds of worlds. He could end Guilliman's resurgence with one well-placed strike in the warp. But he does not, because vengeance was never his purpose. Even now, after demonic ascension, after exile, after betrayal, Magnus' war is not against the Imperium. It is against forgetting. He refuses to let the galaxy forget what was lost. He keeps the memory of Prospero alive, not just as a world, but as a question the Imperium dares not ask, a question it hides behind shrines and purges in silence. What if we had listened? So he watches and waits. In the planet of sorcerers, his sons, those who remain, study, fight, burn. The Rubrici stand silent in endless vigil, armor polished, weapons ready, eyes empty. They do not speak, but Magnus knows their names. All of them. He walks among them sometimes, not as a god, but as a father who remembers. The warp may change his form, reshape his voice, make myth of his presence, but it has not taken his grief. It has not stolen his love, that it could never touch. In the rarest moments, when the eye is calm and the screaming winds lull to whispers, he sees the past. Prospero, golden and warm, his sons, laughing in the sunlight, scrolls unfurling, debates echoing across marble halls, hope burning like a second sun. He sees it all, and then it fades, and he returns to the throne, watching, waiting. The galaxy will call him traitor until its last breath. But one day, when the Imperium chokes on its silence, when its blind march finally breaks, when a single voice dares to question the past, the truth will surface. They will look into the eye and see not a demon, but a father who never stopped watching. Magnus the Red, the son who knew too much and could never look.